Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. And today I'm going to be talking about Edward and why I find him to be a kind of boring character to write for. Let's talk. I'm hoping most of you already know who Edward is, but in case you don't, here's a short introduction. Edward was created by the Reverend W. Awdry. He made his first public appearance in the Free Railway engines in 1945. Edward is an old engine, a 440 to be exact. He is based off a Furness Railway K2. He was the second engine purchased by Sir Topham Hatt to run on the North Western Railway. Hopefully that was a good enough introduction, cause now let's talk about why I find Edward to be a boring character to more specifically write for. Before I continue, I have to say that I do really like Edward. He is not one of my favorite characters, but he is very fun, and I do really like him to be a supporting role. In stories like The Deputation, he works quite well to be an old and wise engine to advise Percy. Edward is not a bad character, he's just not a good character to be in a leading role. And that's because he is simply just too perfect. Like I mentioned, he is supposed to be a supporting figure and be the old and wise engine to give advice to the younger engines. This does not allow Edward to make mistakes. He is simply, like I said, too perfect, and that does not allow him to be the center of attention in stories. The only story in the Railway series where he is the main focus is Edward's exploit, and in that he doesn't change as a character, he only goes through something rough and that's it. I do like Edward's exploit, but it doesn't change Edward, it only changes how others perceive him. That's the problem with a bunch of Edward stories. In all of the stories in Edward the Blue Engine, they're mostly about other characters, with Edward only being a focus in some of them. Old Iron is about James, with Edward only helping James's character growth. Edward himself doesn't go through a character arc, he mostly just helps others go through their character arcs. The only other Railway series story that is about Edward is Edward's Day Out, but all that happens in that story is that Edward waits at a station, like nothing else happens. That's why the TV show combined that story with Edward and Gordon, which I think works very well. Speaking of the TV show, the show gave Edward a lot more focus and even his own episodes, but most of them are really bad. Edward's inclusion in some stories like Escape really helped that story to feel more grand in my opinion, but then we get to some of the Edward focus episodes. Episodes like Edward the Really Useful Engine. It falls into the same trap with not being about Edward but more so being about the characters around him. More specifically Gordon in this scenario. Edward's Brass Band is an alright Edward episode, but when we get to the hit era, that's when things start going downhill. Edward the Great is regarded as being one of the good episodes of the hit era, but in my opinion, Edward acts so pathetic in this episode. It is nothing in line like he was in the classic series. It just doesn't feel like the same character. Saving Edward suffers from the same problem where Edward just acts pathetic. And let's not talk about Edward Strikes Out. I'd rather forget that episode exists. As much as the hit era did Edward wrong, they at least tried to do one thing that I think Edward really needs, and that is some flaws. Like I stated earlier on in the video, Edward is just too perfect in the Railway series and the classic series, so giving him some flaws would really give him more story potential. The problem with the hit era is that they didn't really give Edward a flaw that would fit his character. They just made him old and pathetic. They did the same with Toby, like why did they make them both old and pathetic? They're literally just the same character in the hit era. So, I've come up with two flaws that I think would really benefit Edward. The first one is, he pushes himself too hard. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, Edward is an old engine, but he still wants to do a good job and really prove himself. This could make for an interesting story where Edward wants to prove himself, but can't due to his age. Edward could end up damaging himself due to the fact that he wants to push himself, but is just too old to do what he wants. This flaw could also help some of Edward's other character traits, because while he may not be strong physically, he is very strong mentally. This could make for an interesting situation where Edward has to, instead of using his strength, he has to use his wisdom to solve a problem. That was the first flaw. My second flaw is make him a little bit more self-conscious. Now, I don't mean make him pathetic and old like he is in Edward the Great, but I mean make him more want to exceed the expectations of the other engines around him. A story that I think does this perfectly is Season 11's Edward and the Male. Even though Edward is old, he hasn't done everything in the world, and so giving him a new situation where he has to learn a new skill or something could be really interesting and show that he isn't exactly perfect. Instead of making the engines look down on Edward like in Edward the Great, instead make them have high expectations for him and make them look up to Edward instead, like in James II Best and Edward the Great. This high expectations from the other engines could make Edward self-conscious and not really focus. In my opinion, giving Edward either one of these two flaws could make him get so much more story potential, at least in my opinion. I want to specify once again that I do really like Edward in stories like The Deputations or the TVS adaptation of Escape. In those, he is either giving other engines advice or giving them a reality check. Even though Edward is difficult to put in a leading role, he is very good to be a supporting role in a story. I have neglected to talk about Edward in the CGI series, and that's because there simply isn't that much to talk about. I mean, Edward doesn't really do that much in the CGI series. He makes some good supporting roles and stuff, but otherwise he doesn't really do much. I do really like him in The Adventure Begins though. Anyway, I hope you all enjoy my ramblings on Edward in this video. If you have any thoughts, leave them down in the comments below. Anyway, I hope you all have a great day and make sure to watch out for further videos in the NWR Talks series. Anyways, goodbye.